Eleanor Blackwood had never felt more invisible. As her father, Duke Reginald Blackwood, laughed and clinked glasses with the guests, Eleanor remained a silent witness to the life she would never fully belong to. Her family, draped in the finest silks and smiles, had long since made it clear that she was an outsider in her own house. They all knew she didn't fit, but no one spoke of it. That would have been too cruel. Instead, they let her feel it. Every day, every hour. Her mother, Lady Margaret, spared her a glance from across the room, eyes narrowing as she took in Eleanor's posture, too stiff, too guarded. "Eleanor, darling, do try to be more charming tonight," Margaret called out loudly enough for the crowd to hear, her tones smooth, but cutting like a blade. "A lady of your standing simply cannot afford to be so." Aloof. The words stung, sharper than Eleanor had expected. A lady of her standing. Margaret's voice, though polite, was laced with disdain, as if Eleanor's very presence was a blemish on the evening's perfection. Eleanor's cheeks flushed with humiliation, her fingers gripping the edges of her gown until her knuckles ached. Her father's voice joined in, cold as always. "Indeed, Eleanor, you're hardly making an impression. A bit of conversation with our esteemed guests, perhaps?" Eleanor's gaze flickered to her sister, Elizabeth, who was the picture of grace as she conversed with a group of well-dressed young men. Laughter followed her words, soft and infectious, a stark contrast to Eleanor's stifled silence. Elizabeth had always been everything their parents wanted, charming, poised, and adored by all. But Eleanor, she was the disappointment, the failure. "You see, my dear," her mother continued, her voice a quiet but insistent whisper as she leaned closer, "a woman of your breeding should know how to make herself known. If you can't engage with the others, at least make yourself useful." Eleanor's insides twisted at the words, each syllable a reminder of the weight of expectations she could never meet. She'd tried. God, how she'd tried, but it was never enough. No matter how many perfect smiles she forced, no matter how much she bent and contorted herself to fit into the mold her family demanded, there was always something about her that seemed to fall short, and as the laughter of the gathering continued around her, Eleanor realized she would never be enough for them. Not now, not ever. The more she tried to prove herself, the more she became a ghost in their world, a shadow of the person they wanted her to be. The sound of the grand double doors opening caused a ripple of excitement through the room, as though the arrival of a new guest could bring a breath of fresh air to the stale, tension-filled evening. Eleanor looked up instinctively, drawn by the sudden shift in energy. The Duke of Ashford, Gavin St, Clair, had entered. His reputation had preceded him. Gavin was a man of mystery, known more for his sharp business acumen and commanding presence than for any personal connections. His eyes scanned the room briefly, then settled on a group of the most esteemed guests. As always, he seemed at ease, though a touch of aloofness lingered about him, making it clear that he was a man who moved through these circles without truly belonging to them. A rare quality, one that Eleanor found fascinating, especially given how much she longed for that same sense of detachment. Her mother, of course, was the first to notice, and she immediately glided over to him with a practiced smile, her voice sweet as honey as she welcomed him into their fold. Eleanor's father, Duke Reginald, followed closely behind, his tone deferential but purposeful as he engaged Gavin in conversation. But despite the politeness of their exchange, Eleanor could see the undercurrent of calculation in her father's gaze. Gavin was not here merely to enjoy the evening. He was here for something more, something that could benefit them all. Eleanor, however, could not tear her eyes away. She had seen the Duke at events before, of course. His name had been on the lips of many in their circles for years. But tonight, something about his presence was different. He wasn't simply a bystander. He was a force, a man who commanded attention with nothing more than a single glance. Eleanor felt an unfamiliar tug, a curiosity that she couldn't quite place. It was as if, in that moment, everything else around her faded into the background, leaving only Gavin's presence standing out in sharp contrast. As she watched him converse with her parents, Eleanor couldn't help but notice how effortlessly he interacted with them, all while maintaining a subtle distance. It was clear that he was respected, but not entirely admired. There was something intangible about him, something that made him seem both distant and deeply intriguing. She found herself wondering what it was that gave him this power, this ability to remain detached while still being the center of attention. Her thoughts were interrupted when Gavin's gaze flicked briefly across the room, catching Eleanor's eye. It was fleeting, but in that moment, something shifted. She felt a rush of heat, the kind that came with an unspoken connection, and immediately her mind scrambled to make sense of it. Surely he hadn't noticed her among all the faces in the crowd. Surely it was just a fleeting glance, nothing more. But as the evening wore on, Eleanor found herself inexplicably drawn to him, watching his every movement with a mixture of admiration and uncertainty. Was this simply the effect of a man of his stature, or was there something more? She couldn't tell, but she had the sense that she was only just beginning to understand what it was that made Gavin St, Clair, such a compelling figure. Eleanor's nerves were already frayed from the evening's earlier humiliations, but her mother's voice, piercing through the murmur of the crowd, cut through her like a blade. "Eleanor, darling, what on earth is the matter with you? You're standing in the corner like a wallflower, and it's simply not done." Lady Margaret's voice, smooth but commanding, echoed throughout the drawing room, drawing the attention of several nearby guests. Eleanor's stomach churned. She felt the familiar sting of humiliation wash over her. She had never been able to meet her mother's expectations, never been the daughter who sparkled in social settings the way Elizabeth, her younger sister, did effortlessly. Elizabeth was the darling of every ball, the center of attention, always charming, always adored. And Eleanor, well, she was simply there, a pale shadow in the background, a constant reminder of how far she had fallen short. She looked across the room at her sister now, Elizabeth deep in conversation with two young men, her laughter musical and light. The way they hung on her every word was both maddening and heartbreaking. Eleanor wanted nothing more than to blend into the background and disappear completely, but her mother's sharp, disapproving gaze would not let her. "Honestly, Eleanor, if you can't even manage the simplest of social graces, what good are you?" Margaret continued, her voice dripping with disdain. "Do you realize how much your behavior reflects on this family?" Eleanor's chest tightened as the words settled into her bones. She had never been good enough, never measured up to their standards. Every breath she took, every word she spoke, seemed to confirm the conclusion they had already drawn. She was a disappointment. The feeling of inadequacy that had haunted her for years now felt like a weight she could no longer bear. Her father, Duke Reginald, joined in, his voice colder than the marble floors beneath their feet. "A bit of conversation wouldn't hurt you, Eleanor," he said, his tone businesslike but no less biting. "You ought to be more like Elizabeth. Look at her, always the picture of grace and elegance. If only you could learn something from her." Eleanor glanced at her sister again, whose beauty and charm seemed to fill the room, making Eleanor feel even smaller. She couldn't deny that Elizabeth had always been the golden child, the one who effortlessly attracted admiration. And yet, even now, as her father's words hung in the air, Eleanor could feel the space between them widening, the gap between the perfect daughter and the one who could never measure up. As Eleanor stood there, barely able to keep her composure, she felt the eyes of the guests on her, their judgment almost palpable. She could hear the murmurs, the whispered comments behind fans and gloved hands. She was the source of their amusement, their pity. To them, she was the ugly duckling, the misfit, the disappointment. Eleanor wanted to flee, to run from the suffocating weight of their gaze. But instead, she remained frozen, her face an impassive mask as the world around her continued, indifferent to her silent torment. It was the same every time, the same cruel ritual of rejection. And yet, no matter how much she tried to please them, she was always left standing at the edge, an outsider in her own family. Eleanor could still hear her mother's voice echoing in her mind, the biting words, the subtle but unmistakable dismissal. She could almost feel the weight of their gaze upon her, even as she stepped into the cool night air, away from the warmth and suffocating pressure of the ballroom. She needed a moment to collect herself, to regain some semblance of composure before she could face the rest of the evening. The garden was quiet, the moonlight casting long shadows on the well-manicured paths. Eleanor wandered slowly, letting the silence wrap around her like a comforting cloak. She hadn't meant to come out here, but the oppressive air inside had become too much to bear. The sound of voices, the clinking of glasses, the false pleasantries, it all felt suffocating. Out here, there was nothing but the gentle rustle of the leaves and the scent of roses in the air. For a moment, she allowed herself to close her eyes and breathe deeply, trying to calm the tremors in her chest. She had always longed for moments like this, for peace and solitude away from the expectations and judgments of her family. But even as she stood there, the weight of her mother's criticism still hung heavily in her mind. It was then that she heard footsteps on the gravel path. Eleanor stiffened, turning to see who it was, fully expecting to find one of the servants, or perhaps another guest who had slipped away for a breath of fresh air. But instead, to her surprise, it was Gavin St, Clair, the Duke of Ashford. He looked at her with an expression of quiet curiosity, as though he'd been aware of her presence the entire time, but had waited for the right moment to approach. His sharp features were softened by the moonlight, and for a brief second, Eleanor wondered what it would be like to see him up close, without the barrier of society's expectations between them. "You're a long way from the festivities," he said, his voice calm and measured, like a quiet thread of reassurance in the otherwise still night. Eleanor blinked, unsure of how to respond. She hadn't expected him to find her out here, let alone speak to her in such an intimate, unguarded way. "I needed a moment to myself," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper, betraying the fragility she was trying to mask. Gavin took a step closer, his gaze softening as he studied her. "I understand," he said, his tone so genuine it made her heart ache. "I've seen enough of these grand occasions to know that sometimes the pressure can become overwhelming." Eleanor swallowed, her throat tight with emotion. She didn't know why, but for a brief moment, she felt as though she could tell him everything: the weight of her family's rejection, the pain of being ignored, the constant effort to be someone she wasn't. But instead, she simply nodded. Gavin smiled, a faint curve of his lips that was more understanding than flirtatious. "Would you like to take a walk?" he asked, his offer genuine, a subtle escape from the suffocating world they'd just left behind. Eleanor hesitated, unsure if it was proper or if it would make things worse, but something in his eyes made her want to say yes, to take that moment of respite, however brief. She nodded, a small gesture, but enough to convey her acceptance. And as they walked side by side, away from the laughter and the judgments of the ball, Eleanor couldn't help but feel the tiniest flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way to find her place in this world, not through her family's expectations, but through a quiet understanding with someone who saw her, really saw her, for who she was. The garden was quiet, bathed in the soft glow of moonlight. Eleanor had expected nothing more than a brief, awkward walk with Gavin, perhaps to escape the oppressive energy of the party. But as they strolled along the stone paths, the air seemed to grow lighter, and for the first time that evening, she could breathe without feeling the weight of judgment pressing on her chest. Gavin didn't speak at first, which was a relief. His silence wasn't uncomfortable, though. It was the kind of quiet that invited reflection, the kind that allowed Eleanor to gather her thoughts without feeling the need to fill the air with words. She glanced at him out of the corner of her eye, noticing the way the moonlight caught in his dark hair, making him appear almost ethereal. But it wasn't his looks that caught her attention. It was the calm, composed manner in which he carried himself. Unlike the other men at the gathering, who seemed to always have a smile ready for show and a word for every situation, Gavin exuded an air of quiet authority, as though he didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Eventually, he broke the silence. "You're not like the others in there, are you?" His voice was low, yet somehow piercing. Eleanor stiffened, unsure of how to respond. "I don't think I fit in with them," she said quietly, keeping her eyes on the ground as they walked. "But I've spent my life trying to be what they want me to be." Her words came out in a rush, as though she had been holding them in for too long. Gavin didn't reply immediately, but the steady rhythm of his footsteps told her he was listening. When he spoke again, his tone was gentle, but firm. "I've seen the way they look at you, Eleanor, and I don't know much about your family, but I do know this. They're wrong about you." Eleanor stopped walking for a moment, the shock of his words catching her off guard. She turned to face him, her heart beating faster, though she couldn't quite understand why. "You don't know them. You don't know what they expect of me. No matter how hard I try, I'll always be the one who doesn't live up to their standards." His gaze softened, and he stepped closer to her, his presence calming yet intense. "I don't need to know your family to see you for who you are. I can see it in the way you carry yourself, the way you don't bend to their will, even though they try to break you. You're stronger than they'll ever realize." Eleanor's throat tightened, and she looked away, unsure of how to respond to such a raw, unexpected compliment. She wasn't used to people speaking to her with such honesty, especially not after years of being dismissed by her own family. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, reminding her how little she mattered. But Gavin's words were different. They weren't about how she could improve or change. They were about accepting who she already was. "You don't have to say that," Eleanor murmured, her voice almost too soft to hear. "I'm not what they want." Gavin smiled, a small, understanding smile that made her feel like she wasn't so alone in the world. "I don't care what they want. I care about what you want, and what you deserve." Eleanor's heart stuttered in her chest at his words. What she deserved. No one had ever asked her that before. No one had ever cared to know. She swallowed hard, fighting back the overwhelming wave of emotion that threatened to swallow her whole. I don't know what I want, she admitted quietly, but I think I want something more than this. There was a long silence between them, the kind that seemed to stretch out into eternity, and for the first time that evening, Eleanor allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there could be more for her, something beyond the suffocating expectations of her family, something she could claim for herself. The night air had cooled since Eleanor's walk with Gavin, but the chill she felt upon returning to the manor was nothing compared to the ice in her veins. Her family's judgment, sharp and unwavering, had returned to haunt her the moment she re-entered the ballroom. The laughter, once light and carefree, now sounded like cruel mockery. The warmth of the room, the grand chandeliers, the rustling of silk dresses, everything felt suffocating. She could feel their eyes on her, every glance a reminder of her inadequacy. "Where have you been?" Her mother's voice cut through the noise, cold and pointed. Lady Margaret stood at the entrance, her eyes narrowing as she took in Eleanor's return. "You look like you've been up to something. Is that the way a lady should behave? Wandering off in the middle of a gathering?" Eleanor tried to swallow the lump in her throat, but it stuck there, a painful reminder of everything she couldn't escape. Her mother's face was a mask of polite concern, but beneath it was the unmistakable disapproval, as if Eleanor's mere presence was an inconvenience. "I just needed some air," Eleanor replied, keeping her tone even, though her voice quivered despite her best efforts. She hated how weak she sounded, but there was nothing she could do to stop it. It had always been this way. Her mother's gaze, sharp and scrutinizing, always seemed to pierce through her, leaving her feeling small and insignificant. "Well, you've made quite the impression," her father's voice boomed from across the room. Duke Reginald Blackwood was speaking with a few of the local aristocrats, but his words were clearly intended for Eleanor. "An impression of one who doesn't appreciate the privilege of being here. Must we constantly remind you how fortunate you are?" The sting of his words hit her harder than any verbal lashings her mother could have delivered. Duke Reginald was a man who commanded respect, but he did so by crushing others under his expectations. Eleanor had spent her life trying to measure up to his impossible standards, but no matter what she did, it was never enough. And now, his voice dripped with frustration as he addressed her like a child in need of correction. "Perhaps you should try to be more like Elizabeth," he continued, his words filled with the kind of praise that always went straight to Eleanor's heart. "Your sister knows how to handle herself in social settings. Maybe you could learn something from her. She's the one people admire." Eleanor's eyes darted to her sister, standing just behind their father, smiling as if she had not a care in the world. Elizabeth's beauty, charm, and effortless grace were everything Eleanor had never been. Her father's words rang in her ears, and though she desperately wanted to escape to the quiet of the garden again, she stood frozen in place, feeling more like an outsider in her own family than ever before. Elizabeth's soft giggle and the way she basked in their father's approval made Eleanor feel even more invisible. She knew that no matter how hard she tried, she would never be the daughter her parents wanted her to be. The pressure of their expectations was suffocating, but Eleanor had learned long ago that there was no escaping it. "I'll try harder, father," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. It was all she could do to keep the tears at bay. The following week, Eleanor could hardly escape the whirlwind of whispers that followed her everywhere. The society pages buzzed with talk of her family's latest arrangements, and her father's insistence that she marry Gavin St. Clair had become a topic of whispered conversations in every corner of Blackwood Manor. It seemed as though there was no corner of her life that was untouched by her family's ever-present gaze. She had been called to a private meeting with her father, and as she sat before him in his study, Eleanor felt an almost physical weight pressing down on her. The walls of the room seemed to close in, the grand, imposing furniture offering no comfort. Duke Reginald Blackwood sat behind his desk, his eyes fixed on her with a cold intensity that made her heart race. "Eleanor, it's time we discussed your future," her father began, his tone flat but unyielding. "I've spoken to Gavin, and he's agreed to the arrangement. This is a business deal, yes, but it will also benefit you. You are in a position to elevate this family's name, and you must understand the importance of this." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She had suspected this moment was coming, but hearing the words spoken aloud felt like a slap. Gavin's proposal was nothing more than a tool, something to be used for the betterment of her family, not for love or connection. The weight of the realization settled heavily on her chest, She met her father's gaze but could find no sympathy there. "Father, I don't know if I can," she began, but her voice faltered. What could she say? How could she express the confusion and fear that churned within her? She had never been allowed to have a say in her own future, never been given the space to choose for herself. Everything had always been about what was best for the family, about what would secure their status. "You will marry Gavin," Duke Reginald interjected, his voice firm and resolute. "He is an ideal match. You have no other options. Your future is secured. You are fortunate to have such a match, especially with the current climate." The word fortunate echoed in Eleanor's mind. What was fortune to him? To her, it felt like a prison sentence. No more freedom, no more choice. She would be bound to a man she barely knew, all for the sake of keeping up appearances and securing the family's future. The thought of it suffocated her. "But I don't love him," Eleanor finally said, her voice small but clear. The words felt like they were ripping from her chest, as though saying them aloud might shatter everything around her. Her father's gaze softened, but only for a moment. "You don't need to love him, Eleanor. This marriage will bring us respect, stability, and influence. That is what matters." The thought of a life bound to duty and expectation, without the possibility of love or genuine connection, twisted Eleanor's stomach. She had been taught to honor duty above all else, but in that moment, something inside her snapped. Was she nothing more than an instrument to be used? "I understand, Father," she whispered, though her heart screamed otherwise. She didn't know if she could go through with it. But what choice did she have? Eleanor sat in the drawing room, her hands folded in her lap as she waited for her father and mother to arrive. The air in the room was thick with tension. She had known that this conversation was coming, but she still wasn't prepared for it. After her private discussion with her father about Gavin's proposal, the full weight of her family's expectations had begun to bear down on her. She had never felt more like a pawn in a game that she couldn't win. Her father entered first, his stern face as unreadable as always. Lady Margaret followed closely behind, her expression cool and calculating. Eleanor's heart raced as she rose to her feet, her mind still spinning from the conversation she had had with her father only days before. "Well, Eleanor," her mother began, her voice icy and controlled, "we've heard the news. You're to marry Gavin St. Clair." She paused, her lips curling slightly. "I must say, I'm not sure I understand why you've hesitated for so long. It's an excellent match, financially secure, with a title to boot. This is what you've been trained for." The words stung, and Eleanor fought to keep her composure. She had always known that her value in her family's eyes was based on her ability to make advantageous marriages, but hearing it stated so bluntly, in such a casual tone, made her feel sick to her stomach. "I never said I was hesitating, Mother," Eleanor replied, her voice tight. "But I think there's more to a marriage than financial security. It's not just about status and titles. It's about something deeper, something real." Her father's expression hardened as he took a step toward her. "You will not question this decision, Eleanor. It is for the good of the family. Gavin is a man of considerable influence and wealth. This marriage will secure your future, and by extension, the future of the Blackwood family. Do you understand that?" Eleanor's throat tightened, and she had to swallow hard to keep the rising tide of frustration at bay. She had always been the one who was expected to keep the peace, to maintain the image of the dutiful daughter. But now, as the weight of her family's disapproval crashed down upon her, she felt a spark of rebellion flicker within her. "No, Father, I don't understand," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper, but there was a steel to it that surprised her. "You want me to marry a man I barely know, for nothing more than his title and wealth. And yet you've never once asked me if I could be happy with that." Her father's gaze grew cold, his voice low and dangerous. "Your happiness is secondary, Eleanor. The family's happiness, reputation, and future come first. You do not get to be selfish in this." Eleanor recoiled at the venom in his words. The years of quietly acquiescing to his demands suddenly felt like an eternity. She had been the dutiful daughter, always striving to please. But now she could feel the full weight of what was being asked of her. Her mother stepped forward, her face unreadable. "You will marry Gavin, Eleanor. There is no alternative." Eleanor stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. The weight of her family's expectations pressed down on her, suffocating her, but for the first time, she didn't know if she could comply. There had to be more to life than this. There had to be more than just fulfilling her family's demands. Eleanor lay awake that night, her mind racing. The conversation with her parents had left her shaken, but it was also a turning point. She could no longer ignore the underlying truth. Her family saw her as nothing more than a tool to be used, a bargaining chip in a game of social status. They didn't see her as a person, with hopes and dreams of her own, but as a means to an end. The weight of this realization pressed heavily on her chest. She had always known that her family's love came with strings attached, but now she saw just how far they would go to control her. Gavin's proposal, though it had initially seemed like a lifeline, now felt like a cage. His offer to marry her, though framed as a kindness, felt more like an arrangement than a romance. She had tried to convince herself that perhaps she could learn to love him, that perhaps his calm demeanor and sharp wit could be enough to build a life with him. But as the evening wore on, Eleanor's doubts grew. Was this what her life would be? Bound to a man she didn't love, fulfilling her family's wishes while suppressing her own desires? The thought of marrying Gavin, however, was still tempting. There was a certain safety in it. Her family would approve, and she would no longer be the source of their shame. She could finally escape the constant scrutiny of their critical eyes. But what would she be left with? A life without love? A life built on obligations and duties rather than genuine connection? She turned over in bed, the sheets tangled around her body as she pondered her options. The decision before her seemed impossible. Marrying Gavin would fulfill the role her family had always expected her to play, a dutiful daughter, a compliant wife, a symbol of their success. But would it make her happy? Could she live with the emptiness of a marriage built on duty rather than affection? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Eleanor froze, her heart skipping a beat as she realized someone was approaching her door. She listened closely, her breath shallow, until a soft knock echoed through the room. "Eleanor?" The voice was low and steady, and her pulse quickened as she recognized it. "Gavin." She quickly rose from her bed, brushing her disheveled hair away from her face. Hesitant, she opened the door to find him standing there, his presence both comforting and unsettling. Gavin's gaze was soft, but there was an intensity in his eyes that made her heart flutter. "I'm sorry to disturb you," he said, his voice gentle. "I wanted to speak with you." Eleanor stepped aside, allowing him to enter. The air between them was charged, both of them acutely aware of the unspoken tension that lingered. She had expected him to speak of the marriage, to press her for a decision, but instead, he simply watched her, as if waiting for her to find the words herself. "Gavin," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I don't know what to do. I don't know if I can marry you. I don't know if I can marry anyone. Not like this." He stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to decide right now, Eleanor. Take your time. I'm not asking you to marry me out of obligation." His words, though sincere, did little to quell the storm of emotions inside her. She had spent her life trying to make everyone happy, trying to be the daughter her family wanted, the woman society expected. But now, for the first time, she wasn't sure who she was or what she wanted. The night of the ball arrived, and with it, the weight of expectation pressed down on Eleanor more than ever. The grand chandeliers glittered above her, casting soft, golden light on the elegantly dressed guests who mingled, laughed, and exchanged pleasantries. Yet, as Eleanor entered the ballroom, the usual sense of anxiety settled in the pit of her stomach. She was used to the stares, the whispers, the polite smiles that hid contempt, but tonight felt different. Her father, ever the politician, was already in the thick of things, shaking hands with influential figures, while her mother hovered nearby, effortlessly charming the crowd. Elizabeth, her younger sister, was once again the shining star of the event, surrounded by admirers who looked at her with reverence. Eleanor's gaze followed her, and she couldn't help but feel the sharp contrast between herself and her perfect sister. It was a familiar sting, but tonight it hurt more than usual. Eleanor moved quietly through the crowd, doing her best to stay unnoticed, though she knew that wasn't possible. There was always someone watching, always someone ready to offer a judgment or a critique. She had spent most of her life trying to fit into a mold that was never made for her. But tonight, she could feel the cracks in the facade beginning to show. The weight of her family's expectations pressed down harder than it ever had before. Her thoughts were interrupted when she felt a presence beside her. Looking up, she met the steady gaze of Gavin St, Clair, the Duke of Ashford. His mere presence seemed to cut through the noise of the ballroom, as if the crowd parted just for him. There was a quiet confidence about him, an assurance that no one could ignore. "May I have this dance?" Gavin's voice was low, calm, yet there was something about the way he asked, so casual, yet with an undertone of something more, that sent a flutter through Eleanor's chest. For a moment, she hesitated. The idea of stepping onto the dance floor, especially with him, seemed almost impossible. She was painfully aware of her family's eyes on her, the weight of her mother's disapproving stare already burning into the back of her neck. But before she could speak, Gavin's hand was already extended toward her, his expression one of quiet determination. "I won't take no for an answer," he said, his tone light but unyielding. And for the first time in what felt like years, Eleanor allowed herself to consider the possibility of stepping outside the boundaries of her family's control. She placed her hand in his, the warmth of his touch sending a shiver through her. The music began, and they moved onto the dance floor together, Eleanor's steps unsure at first but gradually finding their rhythm as Gavin guided her. The dance was slow, a gentle waltz, but every step seemed to carry a deeper meaning. With each turn, Eleanor could feel the eyes of the room upon them. It was clear that her presence with Gavin was making a statement, one that could not be ignored. But strangely, it didn't make her feel exposed or vulnerable. Instead, it was as if they were the only two people in the room. As they swirled around the floor, Eleanor's thoughts began to quiet. Gavin's hand was steady on her back, his touch warm and reassuring. For a brief moment, she could forget the weight of her family's expectations, the judgment of the world around her. She could simply exist, here in this moment, with him. The music reached its crescendo, and as they slowed to a stop, Eleanor found herself looking up at Gavin, her heart pounding in her chest. "You're not like the others," she whispered, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Gavin smiled, a hint of something deeper in his eyes. "Neither are you." For the first time, Eleanor felt seen, and in that moment, she realized that the path ahead, whatever it held, might be something she could choose for herself. The days following the ball were a whirlwind, each one blurring into the next with the relentless pressure of her family's expectations and the growing tension within her heart. Eleanor could no longer ignore the fact that her life was being dictated by everyone but herself. Her father's marriage proposal, Gavin's proposal, her family's approval, all of it seemed like part of the same tangled web she was caught in. But she couldn't make a decision, not yet. The weight of her family's control pressed down on her with suffocating force, and every attempt to break free felt like a futile effort. Then came the letter. It was delivered one morning with the quiet efficiency of her father's trusted butler. The moment Eleanor saw the seal on the envelope, she knew it wasn't a letter of consolation, nor one of encouragement. It was from her father, and it carried with it the unmistakable weight of an ultimatum. Her heart dropped as she tore open the letter, her fingers trembling. "Eleanor, it has come to my attention that you are hesitating about the marriage proposal to Duke Ashford. While I understand your concerns, I must remind you that this union is not only in the best interest of our family's future, but also in your own. The street. Clair family is powerful, their influence immeasurable, and it is crucial that we maintain our standing in society. To delay further would be disastrous. I expect a decision to be made at once. You will not be allowed to drag this on indefinitely. Your cooperation is non-negotiable. Your father, Reginald Blackwood." Eleanor's hands shook as she read the letter, the words searing into her mind. It was a direct command. No room for negotiation, no space for her own desires. She felt the bitter taste of betrayal creep up her throat as she read it again, then again. It was one thing for her family to expect her obedience, but this was something else. The letter made it clear that her father was no longer interested in her happiness, only in maintaining the family's power. The betrayal stung more deeply than she could have imagined. Her father, the man who had always told her that her happiness mattered above all else, had now reduced her to nothing more than a tool. His words rang in her ears. Your cooperation is non-negotiable. That was the truth, wasn't it? She had never been more than a piece in their game, a prize to be won. In that moment, Eleanor felt a flicker of something inside her, something stronger than the fear she had lived with for so long. It was anger, raw and fierce, and it burned brighter than the shame she had carried for years. She had spent her life bending to their will, trying to meet their expectations, trying to make them proud. But now, for the first time, she could see it clearly. They would never be satisfied. No matter what she did, no matter how much she sacrificed, she would always be a disappointment in their eyes. Her hand clenched around the letter as she fought to steady her breath. She had been betrayed, but more importantly, she realized she had betrayed herself by allowing them to control her for so long. The realization stung with its brutal clarity, but it was also the spark she needed. Eleanor knew what she had to do now. Eleanor stood by the window, staring out at the vast gardens of Blackwood Manor. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden hue across the estate. But for Eleanor, The beauty of the moment was lost in the turmoil that churned inside her. She had spent the last few days avoiding the letter from her father, but now the words echoed relentlessly in her mind. It was clear. Her father's mind was made up. He wanted the marriage to Gavin, and there was no room for negotiation. It wasn't about love, or even about her future. It was about control. And now, more than ever, Eleanor knew that she had to make a decision. She had thought about it long and hard, her options, her future, her family's betrayal, and the only person who had given her the space to think clearly had been Gavin. He had asked for nothing from her but honesty. Gavin had not tried to manipulate her, not in the way her father and mother had. He had been kind, patient, and respectful. There was a sense of sincerity in him that Eleanor had never known in her family. The sound of footsteps approaching pulled her from her thoughts. She turned just in time to see Gavin entering the room, his dark eyes locking with hers as he stepped forward. He was dressed in his usual tailored coat, but there was something different in the air tonight. The weight of their unspoken tension was palpable, and Eleanor knew this moment had arrived. Gavin paused, his gaze searching hers, as though waiting for some kind of signal. Eleanor took a deep breath, her heart pounding, and moved to meet him. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice trembling slightly, though she forced herself to steady it. "About everything, my family, the proposal, my future." Gavin nodded, his expression softening. "I understand. It's a lot to consider, Eleanor, and I don't want you to feel like you're being pressured into anything. I care about your happiness above all else." Eleanor bit her lip, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I don't think I can marry you, Gavin. Not for the reasons they want. Not because it's a business arrangement. I can't marry you just to secure the family's status, to fulfill an expectation that has nothing to do with me." Gavin's face remained calm, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something deeper, perhaps disappointment, but also a quiet understanding. "I never wanted that, Eleanor. I never asked for your hand for any of those reasons. I asked because I've come to care for you, more than I ever expected." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. The words were simple, but they carried with them the weight of something much more profound. Gavin wasn't speaking out of obligation. His feelings for her were real. "I don't know what to do," Eleanor whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "I've spent my whole life trying to please them, my family, society. I've always been the one who didn't fit. And now, all of this. It's all for everyone else's happiness but mine." Gavin stepped closer, his hand gently resting on her arm. "Eleanor, you don't have to live for anyone else but yourself. I'm here because I want you, but only if you want me too." The sincerity in his voice broke through her defenses, and Eleanor felt a surge of emotion she had long buried deep inside. For the first time, she realized that she didn't have to choose duty over love. She could choose herself. With a trembling hand, she reached up to touch his cheek. "I think I want you too," she whispered. The next morning, Eleanor awoke with a newfound clarity. The uncertainty and fear that had haunted her for so long had begun to fade, replaced by a quiet resolve. She had made her decision, and it was one that would forever change the course of her life. She no longer wanted to live for her family's approval. She no longer wanted to be a pawn in their game. But the decision had not come easily. Even as she stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the simple gown she had chosen for the day, a part of her still wrestled with the consequences. Gavin had given her the space to make up her mind, but now that it was time to face him again, Eleanor couldn't help but feel nervous. Would he still want her? Had she made the right choice? As she descended the grand staircase, she found Gavin waiting in the drawing room. He was standing by the window, his back to her, but she could tell he was aware of her approach. There was a quiet air about him today, a kind of patience that made her feel both nervous and safe at the same time. "Good morning, Eleanor," he said, turning to face her. There was a softness in his gaze that immediately put her at ease. "I hope you've had time to think." Eleanor smiled, her heart beating a little faster. She stepped into the room, her eyes locking with his. "I have," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion, "and I've come to a decision." Gavin's expression remained calm, though his eyes shone with something deeper, something unspoken. He had already made his feelings clear, but now, with Eleanor standing before him, he was waiting for her to say the words. "I know what my family wants," Eleanor began, taking a deep breath. "I know what they've always wanted for me. But that's not what I want. I don't want to marry for duty. I don't want to marry because it's what's expected of me. I want something real, something based on love, not obligation." Gavin's eyes softened as he stepped closer, his hand outstretched toward her. "Eleanor, I've never asked you for anything but the truth. You don't owe me anything. But if you're willing to take that step with me, to build a life with me, then I'm here. I'll always be here." Eleanor felt her heart swell as she took his hand. The warmth of his touch was steady and grounding, and she realized in that moment that, despite all the uncertainty, she had found something worth fighting for. "I want to be with you, Gavin," she said, her voice unwavering. "Not because of our families, not because of titles or wealth, but because I believe in us. I believe in you." Gavin's smile, the one she had seen only a handful of times but had always been genuine, spread across his face. It was a smile full of love and quiet pride, as though he had been waiting for her to make this choice for a long time. "I've been waiting for you to say that," he murmured, his voice full of emotion. "And I promise you, Eleanor, this will never be about duty. It will always be about love." With that, he gently cupped her face in his hands, pulling her into a kiss. Eleanor's heart fluttered as the world around her faded, leaving only the promise of something new and beautiful, a life they would build together, not out of obligation, but out of love. In the days that followed, Eleanor felt as though she were living in a dream, one that had yet to fully take shape. She had made her decision to marry Gavin, to step away from the expectations of her family and build a life based on love rather than obligation. But despite the clarity of her choice, doubt crept in at the edges of her thoughts, lingering like a shadow she couldn't quite shake. Gavin had been nothing but patient and understanding, offering her time to adjust, but Eleanor couldn't stop questioning herself. Could she truly walk away from everything she had known? Was this the right choice for her? Or had she simply acted out of the desperate desire to escape her family's oppressive grip? As she sat by the fire in the drawing room, Eleanor ran her fingers through the soft fabric of her gown, her mind racing with conflicting thoughts. She had spent her life being told what to do, being molded into what her family expected of her. Now, for the first time, she had made a choice for herself. But as liberating as it was, it also felt terrifying. The sound of footsteps approaching broke her from her reverie. Gavin appeared in the doorway, his dark eyes scanning the room before landing on her. He was dressed in a simple but elegant coat, his usual confident demeanor softened by the concern in his gaze. "You're quiet tonight," he remarked gently, stepping toward her. "Are you all right?" Eleanor hesitated, unsure of how to express the turmoil inside her. She had told Gavin that she wanted to be with him, that she believed in their love, but now she found herself unsure. "I'm fine," she said quickly, giving him a forced smile. "Just thinking." Gavin sat down beside her, his presence a steady anchor in the midst of her storm of emotions. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his voice warm with understanding. Eleanor's chest tightened as she turned to face him, her heart racing. She had never been good at hiding her true feelings, and tonight, the walls she had carefully built around herself felt like they were crumbling. I wonder if I've made the right choice," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've spent so many years trying to be what my family wants, and now I'm not sure if I've made this decision for the right reasons." Gavin regarded her quietly for a moment, his gaze never leaving hers. Then, without hesitation, he took her hand in his. "Eleanor, you didn't make this choice out of fear or obligation. You made it because you believed in us. You believed in a future where we can be who we are, without anyone telling us what we should be." Eleanor swallowed, the knot in her throat tightening as she looked down at their joined hands. "But what if I'm wrong?" she asked, her voice filled with doubt. "What if I can't escape the expectations of my family? What if I can't be the woman you deserve?" Gavin's thumb gently brushed over the back of her hand, a calming gesture. "You are the woman I deserve, Eleanor, and there is no one else who could ever take your place. Don't let the fear of what could go wrong stop you from embracing what is right. We can build a life together. I believe in you." His words, simple yet profound, were like a balm to her wounded heart. In that moment, Eleanor realized that the doubts would always be there, lingering in the background, but they didn't have to define her. She had chosen this path, this life, with Gavin, and no matter what obstacles lay ahead, she would face them with him by her side. It had been a week since Eleanor's conversation with Gavin, and though the doubts had not fully disappeared, a quiet confidence had begun to take root in her heart. She was adjusting to the idea of marrying him, to the thought of a future with someone who saw her for who she was, not what her family expected her to be. For the first time, Eleanor felt as though she was taking control of her own destiny. But just as she began to settle into this new life, the calm was shattered by an unexpected crisis. It started with a letter, a terse and urgent communication from her father. The moment Eleanor saw the familiar seal, she knew something was wrong. She opened it immediately, her pulse quickening with apprehension. "Eleanor, it is with great regret that I inform you that our financial situation has become dire. The investments we had counted on have failed, and our standing in society is now threatened. There is only one way to secure our future, and the future of the Blackwood name. The marriage to Duke Ashford must proceed without delay. Your union will provide the necessary stability for us to weather this storm. You must understand the gravity of the situation. Your cooperation is essential. Your father, Reginald Blackwood." The words blurred in front of her eyes as she reread the letter. The crisis her father spoke of was real. The Blackwood family, once powerful and respected, was now on the brink of ruin. Eleanor's heart sank as she processed the implications of what her father was asking. The marriage to Gavin wasn't just about duty anymore. It was the family's last chance to secure their future. Eleanor's hands shook as she folded the letter, her mind racing. She had been ready to embrace her life with Gavin, ready to forge a future based on her own desires. But now, the weight of her family's survival was in her hands. Her father's words echoed in her mind, "Your cooperation is essential." The pressure was unbearable. Her thoughts turned to Gavin. She had come to trust him, to believe that he wanted more than just a political alliance. But now, her marriage to him had become a necessity, not just a choice. It felt as though her decision was being taken out of her hands, forced upon her by the demands of her family. How could she continue with this, knowing that her choice would have such far-reaching consequences? Eleanor found herself standing by the window, the letter clutched tightly in her hands, staring out at the estate. The world seemed to close in around her as she grappled with the weight of her responsibilities. Her family needed her. Gavin needed her. But what about what she needed? She didn't know if she could go through with it, if she could marry Gavin under these circumstances. The stakes had changed. What had once been a promise of love now felt like an obligation, a duty she could not escape. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, Eleanor realized there was no turning back. The world had shifted beneath her feet, and now she had to decide whether she could accept the life that had been thrust upon her, or find a way to break free. Eleanor couldn't sleep that night. The letter from her father had torn through her carefully constructed peace, leaving her mind tangled in knots. She tossed and turned, unable to escape the weight of her responsibilities. The financial crisis that had plagued her family had become more than just a problem. It had become her burden. Her father's words rang in her ears, demanding that she marry Gavin, and marry him quickly, to save their name. "Your cooperation is essential," he had written. She had tried to push the letter from her mind, tried to focus on the path she had chosen with Gavin, but everything had shifted. What had once seemed like a choice made from the heart now felt like an obligation. Could she really marry a man she had come to care for, knowing that the marriage was as much about duty as it was about love? Could she reconcile the love she felt for Gavin with the truth that her family's survival rested on her shoulders? The weight of the decision pressed down on her like a suffocating fog. She had spent so much time struggling against the expectations of her family, yearning for the freedom to make her own choices. But now, the reality of the consequences of those choices was all too clear. She could no longer afford the luxury of deciding solely for herself. Every action, every decision, would impact not only her future but the future of her family. Gavin had been patient with her, understanding of her doubts, but Eleanor could no longer ignore the truth. She had been living in a bubble, sheltered by the illusion of choice, but now the walls were closing in. Her family's needs were real, and her love for Gavin could not change that. The thought of betraying her own desires to fulfill the expectations of others burned in her chest, but she could see no way out. As the morning light crept through the curtains, Eleanor finally gave in to the exhaustion that had been weighing on her all night. She lay back on the bed, her eyes closing, but even in sleep, her mind wouldn't quiet. The doubts continued to echo in her ears, a chorus of voices demanding answers. The next morning, Eleanor stood by the window, staring out at the sprawling gardens below. It was a moment of rare clarity for her, as the sun cast a golden glow over the estate. She had always felt like an outsider here, a bystander in her own life. The grand halls of Blackwood Manor, the expectations, the endless demands, all of it had never truly been hers. The realization struck her like a lightning bolt. She couldn't live this way anymore. She couldn't marry Gavin simply because it was the right thing to do for her family. She couldn't allow herself to be sacrificed on the altar of duty. But what other choice did she have? The pressure was too great, the stakes too high. Her heart ached as she realized there was no easy answer. Eleanor's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. She didn't have to look to know who it was. Gavin, The days after Eleanor's decision felt like a whirlwind. She had spoken to Gavin, sharing her thoughts, her doubts, and the overwhelming weight of her family's demands. He had listened quietly, never rushing her, never pressuring her for an answer. His patience, as always, was a balm to her frayed nerves. But when she finally told him that she was ready to marry him, it wasn't a sense of duty that guided her. It was love, the love that had grown between them in the quiet moments, in the shared glances, in the way he had been there for her when no one else had. With her decision made, the whirlwind of preparation began. The engagement was announced with little fanfare, the quiet certainty of it serving as a stark contrast to the grand declarations that Eleanor had expected. The family, although they had been shocked by her sudden decision to marry Gavin, were forced to accept it. They saw the marriage as a way to save face, to secure their status, but they also understood that Eleanor was no longer the daughter who could be controlled. She had chosen a life for herself. Gavin was as supportive as ever, his steady presence never faltering. As they prepared for the wedding, Eleanor found herself in a strange place. Her life, which had always been dictated by her family's expectations, was now being defined by her own choices. She was free, free from the constant scrutiny, free from the weight of expectations that had held her captive for so long. But freedom, Eleanor realized, wasn't always easy. She had been raised to think that marriage was simply an exchange of duty, a way to secure one's place in society. But with Gavin, she found something deeper, something real. Their love was not built on convenience or obligation. It was built on understanding, respect, and the promise of something more. As the day of the wedding approached, Eleanor found herself growing anxious, not because she doubted her decision, but because she was stepping into a world that was entirely new. She had never imagined that she would marry a man of Gavin's stature, a man with so much power and influence. The thought of being his wife, of taking on the mantle of the Duchess of Ashford, felt daunting, but it also felt right. She stood in front of the mirror, the reflection of her wedding gown taking her breath away. It was simple, elegant, and unlike the gowns her mother had always dreamed of for her. It was a reflection of who she was now, someone who had finally taken control of her life, someone who had chosen love over duty. Gavin had given her the freedom to choose, and now, as she stood in the quiet stillness of the room, Eleanor knew that she was ready to embrace the life that awaited her. She had made her own path, and now she would walk it beside him. The door opened, and there stood Gavin, his presence filling the room like the calm after a storm. He smiled, his eyes softening when he saw her. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice low, filled with emotion. Eleanor smiled back, her heart light. "So do you," she whispered. It was time to begin their new life together, and for the first time, Eleanor felt as though she was exactly where she was meant to be. The day of the wedding dawned bright and clear, the sun streaming through the windows of Blackwood Manor. Eleanor stood at the window of her chamber, staring out at the sprawling gardens. It felt surreal, this moment, this new beginning. She had spent her life under the constant scrutiny of her family, never feeling like she truly belonged. But now, with Gavin by her side, she was finally free to shape her own destiny. And yet, even with the freedom of choice, there was a lingering doubt. The responsibility that came with being the Duchess of Ashford was not something she had taken lightly. The role she was about to assume was one of influence and power, but it also carried the weight of expectations. Her heart raced at the thought of it. She had married Gavin because she loved him, not because it was expected of her. But now, she had to learn how to navigate this new life, one that would be filled with duties she had never imagined. She had always been told what to do, but now, she was in charge of decisions that would affect an entire estate, an entire community. The thought was daunting. Gavin had been patient, guiding her through the early days of their marriage with gentle encouragement. But today, as they stood before their family and friends, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into a role she wasn't entirely prepared for. There was no turning back now. The Duke of Ashford was hers to support, and their future was intertwined with the legacy they would create together. The ceremony itself had been beautiful, a quiet affair in a small chapel, far from the grandeur Eleanor had imagined. It was an intimate gathering, just close family and friends, no pomp or ceremony. It was what she had wanted. Gavin, standing at the altar, had looked at her with such tenderness that she couldn't help but feel like the luckiest woman in the world. But now, as they settled into their new life, Eleanor knew the true test was yet to come. The estate was vast, and the responsibilities that came with it were overwhelming. As the Duchess, she would be expected to manage the household, oversee the running of the estate, and support Gavin in his role as the Duke. She wasn't sure she was ready for all of that. But as Gavin took her hand later that evening, leading her through the halls of their new home, he reassured her in the way only he could. "You're not alone in this, Eleanor. We'll do it together, every step of the way." His words, simple and honest, eased the tension that had been building in her chest. For the first time since she had agreed to this marriage, Eleanor felt a sense of peace. She wasn't just the dutiful daughter anymore, fulfilling the expectations of her family. She was her own person, a partner to Gavin, and she knew that together they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. The weight of her new role still loomed over her, but with Gavin at her side, she was ready to face it. The early days at Ashford Manor were peaceful, but Eleanor soon discovered that peace rarely lasted long in a household as vast and intricate as Gavin's estate. The responsibilities of her new position appeared quickly, almost faster than she could prepare for them. Servants sought her guidance on matters she had never encountered. Stewards asked for approvals regarding land disputes, and letters poured in daily from neighboring households requesting meetings, visits, and favors. Eleanor tried to keep up, but each request weighed on her until she felt smothered beneath it all. Her first true challenge came only a week after the wedding. A group of tenant farmers requested an urgent meeting, claiming that a section of their farmland had been ruined by a recent flood. They sought additional resources to rebuild, and while Eleanor sympathized, she knew the estate's funds were already stretched thin. Gavin had been called away on business that morning, leaving the decision solely in her hands. The thought made her palms grow cold. When the men were led into the drawing room, Eleanor stood tall, though her heart pounded. Their faces were lined with worry, their hats clutched in their hands as they explained their plight. She listened carefully, nodding as each man spoke, but the weight of their expectations pressed heavily upon her. They were looking to her, for help, guidance, and leadership. "What would you have us do, Duchess?" one of the farmers finally asked, his eyes earnest. It was the first time anyone had called her that without hesitation, and the word knotted something deep inside her. Eleanor took a steadying breath. She wanted to help them, but she knew nothing of estate finances or land restoration. Her mind raced with doubts. What if I make the wrong decision? What if I fail them? What if I embarrass Gavin? The fear tightened around her chest, but then she remembered Gavin's words, "We'll do it together, every step of the way." She met the farmer's eyes. "I won't pretend to know every detail of what needs to be done," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, "but I can promise you this, your concerns will not be ignored. I will speak with our estate steward immediately and arrange for a full assessment of the damage. We'll find a solution, one that ensures your families are cared for and the land restored." The men exchanged relieved glances, offering her grateful bows before they left. Once they were gone, Eleanor exhaled shakily, the strength she'd projected melting away in an instant. She sank into a nearby chair, her hands trembling. It had been such a small moment, just a meeting, just a promise, but it felt monumental. For the first time, people were relying on her, not because of her title, but because they believed she could help. When Gavin returned later that evening, she told him everything. His proud smile warmed her to the core. "You handled it perfectly, Eleanor," he said softly. "You're stronger than you think," and for the first time, she believed he might be right. News of Eleanor's meeting with the tenant farmers spread through Ashford Manor faster than she could have imagined. By the next morning, the household staff was buzzing with whispers, some filled with admiration, others tinged with skepticism. Eleanor had expected challenges, but she had not anticipated how closely her every action would be scrutinized. Being the Duchess meant more than overseeing the estate. It meant being watched, judged, and weighed against expectations she had never known existed. As she walked through the halls, she caught snippets of conversation from behind partially closed doors. "She handled it well, I hear," one maid whispered. "Well enough, perhaps," another replied. "But she's new. Being the Duchess is no simple task." Eleanor pretended not to hear, keeping her posture straight as she made her way toward Gavin's study. The doubt in their voices stung, but she understood it. She was young, inexperienced, and had come from a family whose reputation was now faltering. It was natural for people to question her abilities, yet the weight of their uncertainty settled heavily on her shoulders. When she entered the study, she found Gavin speaking with Mr. Alden, the estate steward. Both men quieted when they saw her, though Gavin's expression warmed instantly. Mr. Alden, however, maintained a stiff formality, bowing slightly before stepping back. "Eleanor," Gavin said, crossing the room to greet her. "We were just discussing the farmland issue." Mr. Alden cleared his throat. "With all due respect, Duchess, Some believe the matter requires a more seasoned hand. Perhaps decisions of this scale should wait until the Duke is available. The implication was clear, and Eleanor felt the familiar sting of inadequacy. She lifted her chin. I understand your concern, Mr. Alden. But the farmers needed reassurance. I simply offered them my word that we would look into the situation promptly. Mr. Alden nodded, though his eyes revealed doubt. Of course, Duchess, but the estate finances are delicate. One misstep could worsen matters. Eleanor folded her hands to hide the slight tremble in her fingers. Then tell me what I need to know. Teach me. I want to make informed decisions, ones that serve the estate and those who depend on it. Well, a flicker of surprise crossed the steward's face. He exchanged a glance with Gavin, who gave him an encouraging nod. Slowly, Mr. Alden bowed again. Very well, Duchess. I will prepare the necessary documents. After he left, Gavin moved closer, gently touching Eleanor's arm. You handled that perfectly, he murmured. She let out a soft breath. I feel like everyone is waiting for me to fail. Gavin's expression softened with quiet affection. That's because you're stepping into a powerful role. But power doesn't come from experience alone. It comes from heart, and you have more heart than anyone I've ever known. His words steadied her, easing the tension in her chest. Yet even as she drew comfort from him, Eleanor knew this was only the beginning. Acceptance would not come easily. She would have to earn it, day by day, decision by decision. But as she looked into Gavin's eyes, she felt a spark of determination ignite within her. She would earn it. The letter arrived on a quiet afternoon, delivered by a footman who shifted nervously as he handed it to Eleanor. She recognized the handwriting instantly, her father's bold, unyielding script. For a long moment, she merely stared at the sealed envelope, her heart tightening with a mix of dread and curiosity. She had not heard from her family since the wedding, and she had convinced herself that silence was easier than fresh wounds. But here, in her hands, was the reminder that her past had not entirely released its hold. With a slow breath, Eleanor broke the seal and unfolded the letter. Eleanor, your mother and I have reflected deeply on the recent events. We acknowledge that we may have been severe. The house feels emptier without you. Elizabeth misses you as well, though she hides it as best she can. We wish to speak with you and mend what has been strained. Return home when you can. Reginald Blackwood. Eleanor read the words again, searching for sincerity. Her father was not a man given to apologies, not even partial ones. And yet, here it was, a fractured, imperfect attempt at one. Her heart warred with itself. A part of her longed for reconciliation, for the family she had once believed she belonged to. Another part, the stronger part, remembered every dismissal, every cutting remark, every time they had made her feel small. She folded the letter and held it against her chest as she paced the room. The vast chambers of Ashford Manor no longer felt unfamiliar, yet this letter tugged her back toward a life she had fought so hard to escape. She didn't know if she was ready, or if it was even wise, to return. Gavin found her standing by the window, the light catching the tension in her posture. You look troubled, he said gently. Eleanor handed him the letter. She watched the shift in his expression as he read it, his jaw tightening slightly. Eleanor, he said, lifting his gaze to hers, you owe them nothing. I know, she whispered, but they are still my family. Gavin stepped closer. Only if you choose them to be. The simplicity of his words struck her. Choice, something she had never been allowed before. Her family had always positioned themselves as her only world. But now, she saw clearly that she had built a new one here, a world she chose, not one imposed upon her. I don't know what to do, she admitted. Gavin cupped her cheek gently. Whatever decision you make, I will stand with you. But let it be your decision, not theirs. His unwavering support grounded her. For the first time, she realized she could approach her family not as the timid daughter they once controlled, but as the woman she had become, a duchess who no longer bowed under their judgment. Eleanor inhaled deeply, steadying herself. Then I will see them, she said softly, but on my terms. And for the first time in her life, she felt the quiet power of choosing her own path. Eleanor's decision to visit her family weighed heavily on her in the days that followed. She felt as though she were walking a narrow path between who she had been and who she was becoming. The thought of stepping back into Blackwood Manor, with all its memories and expectations, sent a chill through her. Yet she could no longer ignore the truth pressing at her heart. She needed closure. She needed to face them not as the timid daughter they once commanded, but as the woman she had grown into. The carriage ride to her childhood home was quiet, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels a steady counterpoint to her racing thoughts. She clutched her gloves tightly in her lap, her breath shallow as the familiar silhouette of the manor rose in the distance. Blackwood Manor, with its towering stone walls and immaculate gardens, had once felt like an inescapable fortress. Now, it felt like a relic of a life she no longer belonged to. When she stepped out of the carriage, her mother was waiting at the entrance, her posture stiff, but her eyes softer than Eleanor had expected. Elizabeth stood beside her, twisting her hands nervously, a sight that made Eleanor's heart ache with old, complicated affection. "Eleanor," Lady Margaret said, her voice carefully composed. "Thank you for coming." Eleanor dipped her head politely. "Mother, Elizabeth." Inside, the house looked the same as she remembered. Grand, immaculate, suffocating. They led her to the drawing room, where her father stood by the fireplace, his expression unreadable. Eleanor braced herself. Reginald Blackwood cleared his throat. "I will not pretend we have been the parents you deserved," he began, surprising her. "But we wish to make amends." Eleanor felt her breath hitch. This was more than she expected, more than she ever thought she would hear. Yet something was missing. His voice was steady, but his posture remained rigid, controlled. The reasons behind his words were unclear. She lifted her chin. "Why now?" Her father's jaw tightened. "Because, perhaps we misjudged you, and perhaps we overstepped." It was not a full apology, but it was more than she had ever been offered. Even so, Eleanor felt no swell of relief. Instead, a quiet clarity settled over her like a gentle snowfall. She had spent years craving their approval, believing her worth depended on their affection. But standing before them now, she realized something astonishing. She no longer needed it. Their validation no longer held power over her. Eleanor exhaled slowly. "I appreciate your words," she said softly, "but I am not here to seek forgiveness or approval. I am here because I needed to see for myself that I have changed, and that I am no longer defined by how you see me." End quote. Her mother's eyes widened subtly. Elizabeth bit her lip. Her father's face tightened, but he said nothing. For the first time in her life, Eleanor felt entirely free. She stood, composed and unshaken, a woman no longer bound by the shadows of her past. The journey back to Ashford Manor was quieter than Eleanor expected. As the carriage rolled through the countryside, she felt the remnants of her past loosening their grip on her. The conversation with her parents lingered in her mind, not because it had healed anything, but because it had revealed the truth she needed to see. She no longer sought their approval. She no longer ached for their acceptance. Something inside her had finally shifted, settling into a calm certainty she had never known before. When she arrived at Ashford Manor, Gavin was waiting in the courtyard. His eyes searched hers the moment she stepped down, concern etched across his features. "Eleanor," he breathed, stepping forward. "How was it?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she simply moved toward him, the warmth of his presence drawing her in like a steady flame. For the first time since leaving, she realized how much she had missed him, how much she relied on the quiet strength he offered without condition. Inside the manor, he guided her to the drawing room, his hand steady at her back. "Tell me what happened," he said gently. Eleanor sat beside him, her hands clasped tightly, though her heart felt strangely light. "They want to make amends," she said softly, "or at least, they want to appear as though they do." Gavin exhaled slowly, his brow furrowed. "And how do you feel?" Eleanor looked down at their intertwined hands. For years she had struggled to find her voice, to articulate her worth, to feel like she belonged anywhere. But here, next to him, she felt grounded, seen, safe. She lifted her gaze to his. "I realize something," she whispered. "Something I should have understood long ago. My parents, they don't define me. Their approval doesn't define me. I don't need them to accept me to know my worth." Gavin's expression softened, pride flickering in his eyes. "And there's something else," Eleanor continued, her voice trembling with emotion. "Through all of this, through every doubt, every fear, you've been the one constant. You've never pushed me. You've never tried to control me. You let me find my way, even when I didn't know what I wanted." He brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch gentle. "Eleanor," she swallowed hard. "I love you, Gavin. I didn't know it at first. I didn't understand it. But now I do. I love you with a certainty I've never felt about anything in my life." His breath caught, the depth of her confession visibly stirring him. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Then he cupped her face in both hands, his expression a mixture of tenderness and awe. "I love you too," he murmured. From the moment I saw you standing alone in that ballroom, I saw something in you. Strength, grace, a quiet fire. I wanted to know you. I never expected to love you, but I do, more than I can ever say." Tears prickled at her eyes as he pulled her into an embrace, his arms warm and secure around her. For the first time, Eleanor felt wholly, irrevocably cherished, not for what she could offer, but simply for who she was. The days after Eleanor's heartfelt confession were some of the happiest she had ever known. There was a lightness in her step, a sense of belonging she had never felt before. Gavin had become her anchor, her confidant, her greatest solace. But happiness, as Eleanor soon learned, often came hand in hand with new challenges, tests that revealed the true strength of what one held dear. The first sign of trouble arrived during an afternoon tea hosted by one of the neighboring ladies. Eleanor had attended with the intention of strengthening bonds with the community, but the moment she stepped inside, she sensed a subtle shift in the room. Whispers floated behind gloved hands, eyes darted toward her, and a lingering tension clung to the air like an unwelcome fog. She tried to push past it, offering polite smiles, but the murmurs only grew. It wasn't until Lady Heavily approached her with a thin smile that Eleanor understood the source of the uproar. "My dear Duchess," Lady Heavily began, her tone deceptively sweet, "is it true that your marriage was arranged solely to rescue your family's dwindling fortune? Quite the dramatic tale, if one believes the chatter." Eleanor felt her stomach twist. She forced a calm smile. "My marriage is my own, Lady Heavily. I do not give much credence to chatter." Of course," the woman said lightly, "but people do talk. Some say the Duke only offered for you out of pity. Others claim you pursued him out of desperation. One never knows with these things." The words were sharp, each one striking Eleanor's heart like a small, calculated blow. She excused herself as gracefully as she could, her composure barely holding as she returned to Ashford Manor with trembling hands and a storm brewing in her chest. Gavin found her pacing the drawing room, her breath uneven. "Eleanor?" His voice softened instantly as he took in her distress. "Tell me what happened." She relayed the conversation in halting breaths, each repetition of Lady Haverly's words filling her with renewed shame. She expected anger, perhaps disappointment. Instead, Gavin stepped closer, his expression calm but fierce in its protectiveness. "Did you believe any of that?" he asked quietly. Eleanor blinked, startled. "Of course not." "Then it does not matter," he said simply. "But everyone else believes it." "Let them," Gavin interrupted gently. "People will always talk, especially when they see something strong enough to threaten their expectations. What matters is what we know." His certainty steadied her, but the sting lingered. "I just don't want our marriage to be seen as something pitiable." Gavin lifted her chin, meeting her gaze with unwavering warmth. "Eleanor, our marriage is built on truth, not gossip. And if you need to hear it again, I chose you, not because of your family, or duty, or pity. I chose you because you are remarkable." Her breath hitched as he pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Let society test us," he murmured. "We will not break." And in that moment, Eleanor knew he was right. The days following Lady Haverly's cruel insinuations left an echo in Eleanor's mind, but they no longer held the same crushing weight they once would have. Gavin's steadfast reassurance had steadied her heart, and though society's whispers continued, she began to see them for what they were, shadows without substance. What truly mattered was the bond she and Gavin were building, one forged through trust, understanding, and a growing love that neither of them had expected. One crisp morning, Eleanor joined Gavin in the estate gardens, where he often began his day reviewing plans with the gardeners. But today, he dismissed the staff early, turning to her with a rare, unguarded smile. "I thought we might walk," he said. Eleanor nodded, taking his offered arm. The garden paths were quiet, lined with roses just beginning to bloom. They walked in comfortable silence until they reached the lake at the garden's edge, its still waters reflecting the pale sky. There, Gavin stopped, releasing her arm but taking her hands instead. "Eleanor," he began softly, "I've been thinking about what comes next for us." Her heart fluttered. "Next?" "Yes," he said with a quiet seriousness. "We have endured trials, your family's expectations, society's whispers, even our own doubts. But we have faced them together. And now, I want us to start imagining the life we will build." Eleanor felt warmth bloom in her chest. "What kind of life do you hope for?" Gavin's gaze softened. "One built on partnership, one where your voice carries as much weight as mine, one where we make decisions together, about the estate, about our future, about everything." His sincerity struck her profoundly. She had never imagined a marriage in which she would be treated as an equal. In her family home, her thoughts had been dismissed before they even formed. But here, with Gavin, she felt seen, heard, valued. She squeezed his hands gently. "I want that too," she whispered. "I want a life where we grow together, where we challenge each other, where we choose each other every day." Gavin's smile widened, and he led her to a nearby bench overlooking the lake. They sat, shoulders touching, as he spoke of practical matters, plans for introducing new agricultural techniques on the estate, improvements to the tenant farms, expansions to the school Gavin supported. He invited her opinions on everything, listening intently. Eleanor found her confidence growing with each question he posed. She spoke of ways the estate could better support the villagers, of projects she wished to pursue, of hopes she had never dared to voice aloud. Gavin listened with pride, as though every idea she offered was a treasure. "You're brilliant," he said at one point, his voice filled with awe. "You will make this estate flourish." Eleanor felt emotion rise in her throat. "We will make it flourish," she corrected gently. Gavin leaned closer, pressing a tender kiss to her temple. "Together," he murmured. And as they sat by the lake, planning not just a future but a shared purpose, Eleanor realized she was no longer the girl desperate for her family's approval. She was a woman creating a life she had chosen, a life beside a man who cherished her for exactly who she was. The morning of their public wedding celebration dawned with a soft golden glow, casting warmth across Ashford Manor and its surrounding fields. Although Eleanor and Gavin were already wed, today's ceremony was meant for the world, to present their union before society, to establish Eleanor officially as the Duchess of Ashford, and perhaps most importantly, to mark the beginning of their shared life, not in private whispers, but in confident declaration. Eleanor awoke with a flutter of nerves dancing across her stomach, knowing that all eyes would be on her by midday. Her chambers buzzed with activity as maids arranged her hair, helping her into the gown. Gavin insisted she choose herself, one made not for spectacle but for her comfort and joy. The silk was soft against her skin, the lace sleeves delicate yet strong, much like the woman she was becoming. As she faced her reflection, Eleanor hardly recognized the poised figure looking back. There was no hint of the timid girl who once shrank beneath her family's shadow. This woman stood tall, her eyes clear with purpose. A soft knock sounded before the door opened, just enough for Gavin to peek inside, breaking protocol with a wicked grin. "Forgive me," he murmured, "but I couldn't wait until the ceremony to see you." His voice was warm, rich with emotion. Eleanor laughed softly, her nerves easing. "You're not supposed to be here," she whispered, though she stepped toward him anyway, the sight of him grounding her more than any deep breath could. Gavin entered fully, closing the door behind him. "I know, but today is important, and I needed you to know something before we stand in front of the world." She tilted her head, intrigued. "What is it?" He reached for her hands, gentle yet firm as his thumb brushed over her skin. "Eleanor, whatever happens today, whatever they whisper, whatever expressions they wear, remember that none of it matters. We are already us. Today is merely a celebration of what we have already chosen." Emotion tightened her throat. "I know," she whispered, "but I want to make you proud." Gavin cupped her cheek, his eyes softening. "You already do, more than you know." A maid cleared her throat discreetly from across the room, reminding them the ceremony could not be delayed forever. Eleanor reluctantly stepped back, but the reassurance in Gavin's eyes lingered with her as she made her way to the chapel. The ceremony itself was breathtaking. Flowers adorned the pews, soft music filled the air, and sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting a kaleidoscope of colors across the altar. When Eleanor walked down the aisle, Gavin's gaze locked onto her with such open adoration that the room seemed to fade, leaving only the two of them. As they exchanged vows before the gathered crowd, Eleanor felt a profound certainty settle deep within her. This moment was hers, not gifted, not demanded, but earned. She had walked through fire to reach this place, and now she stood beside a man who had offered her, not obligation, but partnership. When Gavin slipped the ring onto her finger, sealing their vows, the world finally felt right. The celebration that followed their ceremony felt like a dream, soft music drifting through the air, laughter blending with the clinking of glasses, and countless faces turned toward Eleanor with newfound respect. Yet even with the bustle of wishes pressing around her, Eleanor felt anchored by an unshakable calm. This time, unlike every event she had suffered through at Blackwood Manor, she did not feel like a ghost in the room. She felt present, She felt chosen. She felt seen. But amid the joy swirling around them, Eleanor could sense the weight of her new title settling over her shoulders. Becoming the Duchess of Ashford was not simply a matter of exchanging vows. It was a responsibility that stretched far beyond the glittering celebration. Still, as she stood beside Gavin, receiving guests with grace, she found courage in the way his hand never strayed far from hers. Every subtle touch, every glance he sent her way, steadied her. Later, when the festivities had quieted and the crowd dispersed into smaller groups, Gavin guided Eleanor to a quiet balcony overlooking the manor gardens. The moonlight cast a silver glow across the lawns, and a cool breeze whispered through the trees. Eleanor leaned against the railing, drawing in the peaceful night air. "Are you overwhelmed?" Gavin asked softly. Joining her, she smiled faintly. "More than a little. But not in the way I once was. It's different now. I don't feel lost." Gavin brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. "That's because you're not alone." Eleanor turned to him fully, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I know, and I'm trying to trust that I am enough for this role, for the estate, for our people, for you." "Eleanor," Gavin said gently, "you don't have to prove anything to me. You are enough simply by being who you are. Everything else, we learn together." His reassurance soothed her more deeply than she could express. The truth was, she had spent her entire life trying to measure up to impossible expectations. But here, beside the man who saw her strength before she ever recognized it in herself, she could finally breathe. They spent a few quiet moments watching the moonlit gardens before Gavin spoke again. "Tomorrow," he said, "I want to introduce you to the estate council. You'll begin to see how decisions are made here." Eleanor swallowed, nerves fluttering. "Do you think I'm ready?" Gavin smiled. "I wouldn't bring you if I didn't." His confidence wrapped around her like a warm cloak. She nodded, feeling determination blossom where fear once lived. "Very well, then I will do my best." Gavin took her hand, lifting it to his lips. "Your best has never fallen short." Eleanor felt a flush rise in her cheeks, but it wasn't embarrassment. It was pride. For the first time in her life, she truly believed that she could grow into the woman she wanted to be, and she would do so not in the shadow of others, but in the light of a partnership built on trust and unwavering support. Their future, she realized, was beginning now, not with uncertainty, but with promise. The morning sun filtered softly through the tall windows of Ashford Manor's council chamber as Eleanor entered alongside Gavin. It was her first official appearance before the estate council, the group of seasoned advisors, land stewards, and trusted representatives who helped manage the vast properties under the Ashford name. Though she had prepared herself mentally, a flutter still stirred in her chest as she stepped into the room, acutely aware of all eyes turning toward her. Gavin rested a reassuring hand on the small of her back. The subtle touch steadied her. He moved forward with his usual calm authority, and Eleanor followed, her steps measured but confident. She wore a gown in muted blue, chosen deliberately to reflect dignity without extravagance. Today was not about grandeur. It was about capability. "Gentlemen," Gavin began, his voice deep and steady, "I present to you the Duchess of Ashford. As my partner in all matters, she will be involved in the decisions shaping the future of this estate." A murmur rippled across the council table. Some members nodded respectfully. Others exchanged glances, curious, uncertain, perhaps even doubtful. Eleanor felt their scrutiny, but she met it with quiet resolve. She refused to wilt under their gaze the way she once had under her family's. Mr. Alden, the estate steward, cleared his throat. "Your Grace," he addressed her cautiously, "we welcome your presence. Today's agenda concerns the farmland restoration and adjustments to the tenants' leases in light of the recent flood." Eleanor nodded. "I'm aware of the situation," she replied calmly. "Gavin and I discussed it. I hope to hear your assessment." Mr. Alden blinked, perhaps surprised by her readiness, then began outlining the damage, the costs of repair, and the tenants' needs. Eleanor listened intently, her fingers lightly brushing the notes she had prepared. When he finished, a heavy silence settled, an unspoken invitation for her to respond. She drew a quiet breath. "From what I understand," she began, "the flood was unavoidable, but the burden should not fall solely on the tenants. They depend on that land for their livelihood. If we adjust the lease terms temporarily and allocate estate funds for restoration, we can rebuild both the land and their trust." A few council members stirred, exchanging thoughtful looks. Mr. Brown, the elder councillor known for his bluntness, leaned forward. "A generous approach, Duchess, but an expensive one. The estate's finances require caution. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. I agree. That's why the adjustments must be temporary and carefully monitored. But if we fail to support those who work our land, we risk greater loss in the long term. Gavin's faint smile told her she had struck the right balance. Another councillor nodded slowly. It is sound reasoning, he admitted. Practical, yet compassionate. As the discussion continued, Eleanor found her voice growing steadier, her ideas clearer. The doubts she had feared were gradually replaced by respect, earned through competence, not title. By the meeting's end, the council approved her proposed plan. As they exited the chamber, Gavin leaned close and whispered, "You were brilliant." Eleanor felt warmth bloom in her chest. She had not needed to command the room. Her quiet strength had spoken for her. The weeks that followed Eleanor's first council meeting brought a sense of steady rhythm to life at Ashford Manor. Responsibilities continued, each day presenting new matters to address. But Eleanor found herself growing into her role with surprising ease. The estate no longer felt daunting. Instead, it felt like a living, breathing world she was becoming a part of. Gavin had been right. Leadership was learned, step by step, not bestowed all at once. Yet amid the bustle of estate duties, something quieter and deeper began to take root between Eleanor and Gavin. Their evenings together became her most cherished moments, those soft hours after dinner when they walked the gardens or lingered by the fireplace, sharing stories of their childhoods, dreams they once thought impossible, and visions of a future still forming. One evening, as they strolled through the orchard, the sky streaked with pink and gold, Gavin slowed his steps. Eleanor felt his hesitation before he spoke. "There's something I've been wanting to talk to you about," he began, his tone gentle but weighted. Eleanor looked up at him, her curiosity piqued. "What is it?" He paused, exhaling softly. "I've been thinking about our future, about the life we're building, and I wondered if you've ever imagined expanding our family." She stopped walking. The breeze rustled the leaves above them as her heart skipped a beat. Children, the idea had hovered at the edges of her mind, but had always seemed distant, abstract, something that belonged to a version of herself she wasn't sure she could become. "I don't know if I would be a good mother," she said honestly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't exactly given an example of warmth or understanding growing up." Gavin turned to face her fully, taking her hands in his. "Eleanor," he murmured, "you are the kindest, most thoughtful person I have ever known. You see people's struggles. You listen. You care. Those are the qualities that matter, not perfection." She swallowed hard, emotion rising unexpectedly. "But what if I fail? What if I repeat the same mistakes my parents made without meaning to?" "You won't," Gavin said with quiet certainty, "because you know what it felt like to grow up without unconditional love, and because you have the courage to choose differently." Tears pricked at her eyes. His faith in her had always been one of the greatest gifts he offered, constant, unwavering, grounding her even when her own fears clouded her vision. Gavin brushed a thumb across her cheek, wiping away a tear that had escaped. "We don't have to decide anything now," he added softly. "I just want you to know. I can imagine a future where our home is filled with more laughter, more life, but only if you want that too." Eleanor leaned into him, resting her forehead against his chest as his arms wrapped around her. "I think," she whispered, her voice trembling with vulnerable truth, "I think I can imagine it too." Gavin pressed a tender kiss to her hair, holding her close. In that moment, beneath the fading sunset, Eleanor felt the world shift gently around her. A future she once feared now felt possible, warm, hopeful, and hers to claim. The next morning dawned softly, sunlight warming the curtains of Eleanor's chambers as she slowly awakened. The previous evening lingered in her thoughts, the quiet orchard, Gavin's gentle voice, and the tender possibility of a future she had once been too frightened to imagine. Children. A family built not from obligation or expectation, but from love. The idea no longer terrified her. Instead, it warmed her, like sunlight settling over cold stone and coaxing it into life. She rose with a sense of purpose and found Gavin in the breakfast room, already pouring tea. When he looked up and saw her, his smile held a softness that made her heart flutter. "Good morning," he said, pulling out a chair for her. "Good morning," she replied, settling beside him. There was comfort in the simple moment, in the ease of being close to him without needing to say anything more than that. After breakfast, Eleanor joined Gavin for a walk through the manor grounds. Spring had begun to unfurl across the estate, and the gardens were dotted with new blooms, gentle reminders that life could begin again after the harshest winters. As they walked, servants paused to greet them with genuine warmth, not the hesitant curiosity of months past. Eleanor returned each greeting with confidence. She was no longer an outsider here. She belonged. Near the rose garden, Mrs. Whitford, the housekeeper, approached with a hesitant smile. "Your Grace," she said, dipping her head, "I just wish to say, the staff speak highly of you. They appreciate how you listen. It means more than you know." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm. "Thank you," she said softly. "I only want to do right by all who live and work here." "You do," Mrs. Whitford assured her before excusing herself. Gavin turned to Eleanor with raised brows. "You realize they adore you." She laughed lightly. "I'm still learning, and yet," he said, brushing his fingers against hers, "you've already changed so much here." They continued toward the stables, where several villagers were waiting with petitions and questions. Eleanor handled each matter with care, asking after their families, offering thoughtful suggestions, and promising to oversee the issues personally. She no longer felt the tremor of uncertainty that once accompanied every decision. Instead, she felt grounded, steady. When the final villager left, Gavin stepped toward her, admiration shining openly in his eyes. "You were remarkable," he murmured. Eleanor felt a swell of pride, not the brittle pride her family had flaunted, but something deeper, earned through patience and compassion. "I finally feel like I understand this place," she said quietly, "and my place in it." Gavin took her hands, lifting them to his lips. "Your place," he said softly, "is wherever you choose to stand, but I am grateful you choose to stand beside me." Her breath caught, emotion tightening her throat. "There's nowhere else I would rather be." They stood together in the golden morning light, the estate stretching before them, vast, vibrant, full of possibility. Eleanor felt it settle within her. This life, this role, this love, she had found her place, and she had chosen it freely. Spring settled gently over Ashford Manor in the weeks that followed, weaving warmth through the air and coaxing blossoms from every corner of the estate. Eleanor moved through each day with a growing sense of confidence, embracing her responsibilities with grace and learning, piece by piece, the rhythm of leadership. But nothing could have prepared her for the unexpected turn her life was about to take, a revelation that would alter everything she thought she understood about herself and her future. It began one quiet morning as Eleanor sat in her chambers, reviewing letters from various tenants. She had grown accustomed to a slight tiredness these past days, a gentle fatigue she'd attributed to her busy schedule. But this morning felt different. The dizziness came suddenly, a soft sway of the room that left her gripping the edge of the desk. A maid rushed forward with concern, insisting she summon the physician, and though Eleanor protested, she eventually relented. When the physician arrived, accompanied by Gavin, Eleanor felt a stir of nervous energy flutter against her ribs. The physician's examination was gentle and thorough, but his thoughtful frown made her pulse quicken. Gavin stood beside her the entire time, his hand wrapped around hers. Finally, the physician straightened, clearing his throat with a soft smile. "Your Grace," he began, addressing Eleanor, "there is no cause for alarm. What you are experiencing is perfectly natural." He paused, letting the moment breathe. "You are with child." Eleanor stared at him, breath suspended mid-air. The room seemed to quiet around her, the world narrowing into a single fragile moment of disbelief. "With child," she echoed softly. "Yes, Duchess," the physician confirmed warmly. 2 months, if my estimation is correct." Her heart fluttered violently, joy and shock colliding within her chest. She felt Gavin stiffen in surprise before his hand tightened around hers. When she turned to look at him, she found his expression transformed, softened with awe, brightened with wonder, and shadowed with emotion he did not attempt to hide. As the physician excused himself, Eleanor remained seated, still absorbing the revelation. Gavin knelt before her, taking both her hands in his. "Eleanor," he whispered, voice trembling with emotion, "we're going to have a child." Hearing the words aloud made everything suddenly, beautifully real. Tears filled her eyes as she nodded, the enormity of it settling like warm sunlight over her heart. "Gavin," she whispered, unable to speak further. He rose, gathering her gently into his arms, holding her as though she were made of light. "You will be an extraordinary mother," he murmured against her hair, "and our child will grow up surrounded by love." Emotion overwhelmed her, flooding her with gratitude, with hope, with the profound knowledge that her life had expanded in an instant. The girl who once believed she had no worth, no future, no space to exist, was now carrying the next generation of Ashford. When she finally pulled back and met Gavin's gaze, She found her own reflection mirrored in his eyes. Joy, wonder, and a fierce, blooming love. Their future had just grown brighter, and everything was about to change. The news of Eleanor's pregnancy spread through Ashford Manor like a warm breeze, carrying whispers of joy and celebration to every corner of the estate. Servants smiled more broadly when they passed her in the hallways. Villagers sent flowers and wishes, and members of the council expressed genuine delight during their next meeting. Eleanor felt as though she were walking through a world transformed, her steps lighter, her heart fuller than it had ever been. But with joy came a sense of vulnerability, too, a quiet awareness that the world beyond Ashford Manor might not be as kind. Gossip travelled quickly in society, and Eleanor knew her past would be dredged up with renewed interest. The daughter once dismissed by her family was now central to the future of one of England's most powerful estates. People would talk. They always did. Still, Eleanor felt stronger than she had ever been, and when Gavin suggested they attend the spring gathering at Lord Wycliffe's estate, a prestigious event that drew the most influential families, she knew it was time to step into the world, not as the timid girl who had once hidden behind shadows, but as the Duchess of Ashford. The morning of the gathering, she stood before the mirror as her maid fastened the final clasp of her soft cream gown, chosen deliberately to reflect both elegance and subtlety. Her hand drifted to her still, flat belly, a tender smile touching her lips. The life growing within her gave her courage, a sense of purpose that extended far beyond reputation or society's gaze. When Gavin entered the room, dressed in impeccable formal attire, he paused, admiration clear in his eyes. "You look radiant," he said softly. Eleanor felt a blush warm her cheeks. "And you," she murmured, "look dangerously handsome." He chuckled and offered his arm. "Shall we face them together?" She slid her hand into his. "Always." The gathering was already in full swing when they arrived, carriages lining the grand entrance, music drifting from the open doors of the ballroom. As they stepped inside, the room seemed to hush for a fraction of a second, a small, charged moment in which every gaze turned toward them. Eleanor felt the air shift, felt the familiar tightening of old anxiety, but it dissolved the moment Gavin's hand squeezed hers gently. She lifted her chin and met the curious stares with quiet confidence. Whispers rippled through the crowd. "The Duchess looks so well, remarkably poised, considering, and they say she's expecting." Eleanor let the comments slide over her like water. For once, the words did not sting. She was not here to win approval. She was here to stand in her truth, with Gavin, with their child, with the future she had chosen. Lady Haverley approached, lips tight but eyes darting with curiosity. "Duchess," she said, "I hear congratulations are in order." Eleanor smiled warmly. "Yes, Gavin and I are delighted." The simplicity of her answer, spoken without apology or defensiveness, left Lady Haverley momentarily speechless, and in that small triumph, Eleanor felt the world shift again, this time in her favor. She had faced them, and she had not faltered. The spring gathering continued in a whirl of music, conversation, and glittering candlelight. While Eleanor moved gracefully through the ballroom at Gavin's side, she could feel layers of old fears peeling away with every step she took. The stares no longer held power over her, the whispers no longer cut. She had begun to see that people whispered not because she was weak, but because she had become someone they could not ignore. Yet the evening was not without its challenges. As Eleanor and Gavin paused near the refreshments table, an all-too familiar voice sliced through the air, sharp, superior, and unmistakable. "Eleanor?" She stiffened before turning. Standing only a few feet away was her sister, Elizabeth, flanked by two young women dripping in jewels and barely concealed disdain. For a moment, Eleanor felt her breath catch. Elizabeth, who had always overshadowed her, always belittled her, now looked uncertain. "Elizabeth," Eleanor said calmly. Her sister blinked, as though taken aback by the steadiness in Eleanor's tone. "I didn't expect to see you here," she said, her voice teetering between envy and forced politeness. "You seem, well." "I am," Eleanor replied. She kept her posture relaxed, but her heart beat steadily, fiercely, with the strength she had gained. Elizabeth's gaze dropped to Eleanor's stomach, then snapped back up. "They say you and the Duke are expecting," she said, unable to hide the tremor in her voice. Eleanor nodded. "Yes, we are." A flicker of something crossed Elizabeth's face, jealousy, perhaps, or regret. "Congratulations," she managed. One of Elizabeth's companions leaned closer, whispering loudly enough for Eleanor to hear. "She carries the future Duke. Imagine that, after everything." Eleanor felt the old Eleanor stir, the girl who would have wilted beneath such remarks. But she held firm, lifting her chin. "My past may have been unkind," she said softly, "but my future is not defined by it." Elizabeth swallowed hard, her composure cracking slightly. "Eleanor, I never meant—" "You don't have to explain," Eleanor interrupted gently. "I have forgiven you, all of you, not for your sake, but for mine." Silence fell between them, heavy and unexpected. Elizabeth's eyes glistened, and for a fleeting second, the arrogant facade slipped away. "I'm glad you're happy," Elizabeth whispered. "Truly," Eleanor believed her. Before either could say more, Gavin stepped beside Eleanor, slipping an arm around her waist. "Everything all right?" he asked quietly. "Yes," Eleanor said, smiling at him. "Perfect." They moved away as the musicians shifted into a lively waltz. Gavin led her onto the dance floor, his hand steady at her back. As they began to move, Eleanor felt emotion swell in her chest. Not sadness, not pain, but triumph. She had faced her past, not with bitterness, but with grace. She had held her head high in a room where she had once been invisible. She had stood before the sister who once outshined her and found that she no longer shrank in comparison. She had become her own light. And as Gavin twirled her across the floor, Eleanor felt the truth settle deep within her. She had won, not over others, but over herself. The days following the spring gathering brought a gentle peace to Ashford Manor, the kind that seemed to settle into the very walls of the estate. Eleanor felt it each morning she opened her eyes beside Gavin, and each evening when she walked, the quiet corridors lit by golden candlelight. Yet with her pregnancy now known, the estate vibrated with a subdued excitement, anticipation for the future, for the heir who would continue the Ashford legacy. One afternoon, when the sun hung warm and soft over the estate, Eleanor joined Gavin in the nursery wing, a part of the manor she had never explored. Dust sheets covered the furniture, and the faint scent of cedar drifted in the air. Gavin pushed open the tall windows, allowing sunlight to spill across the floorboards. "I thought we might begin imagining the space," he said quietly. Eleanor stepped inside, her breath catching at the sight of the room, vast, bright, full of possibilities. She traced her fingers along a cradle carved with delicate vines, its craftsmanship telling of generations past. "Was this yours?" she whispered. Gavin nodded. "And my father's before me." He paused, his gaze softening. "And now it will be our child's." Eleanor's heart squeezed with tender emotion. "It feels strange," she murmured. "Wonderful, but strange, to think a life we created will rest there." Gavin approached her, slipping an arm around her waist. "I think," he said gently, "that parenthood always feels strange at first, but knowing that we will face it together makes it far less daunting." She leaned into him, absorbing the calm strength he offered. For a moment, they stood in silence, the future blooming quietly around them. Then Gavin spoke again, his voice thoughtful. "Eleanor, I've been considering something." She turned to look at him, her curiosity piqued. "What is it?" His expression shifted, growing serious yet warm. "I want our child to grow up knowing love, not the conditional sort you endured, not expectations masquerading as affection, but real love, the kind that nurtures, protects, and guides." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "I want that too," she whispered. "More than anything." Gavin cupped her cheek, brushing his thumb across her skin. "Then let us make a promise, here and now, not just to each other, but to our child." Eleanor nodded, emotion swelling. "A promise." Gavin took her hands in his eyes steady on hers. "We will raise our child with patience, with understanding, and with freedom to become whoever they choose to be." Eleanor drew a trembling breath, her voice soft but unwavering. "And we will protect them from the shadows that shaped us. We will give them a home filled with warmth, not expectations. Love, not judgment." Their hands tightened together, sealing a vow deeper than any spoken on their wedding day. A promise for the future, a promise of healing, a promise of love. As they stood in the sunlit nursery, Eleanor felt a profound peace settle over her. She had once been a girl lost in the shadows of others' expectations. Now she was a woman building a future, bright, hopeful, and entirely her own. As spring deepened into early summer, Eleanor's pregnancy became more visible, a gentle curve that brought her a surprising sense of pride. She moved through the manor with growing confidence, greeted warmly by staff and villagers alike. Yet despite this newfound peace, one lingering matter remained unresolved, a shadow from her past that demanded to be faced before she could fully embrace the life she was building. That shadow arrived in the form of a letter. It came unexpectedly one afternoon, delivered by a rider bearing her family's crest. Gavin was away meeting with the council when Eleanor broke the seal, her pulse quickening as she recognized her father's handwriting. "Eleanor, your mother and I request your presence one final time. There are matters we wish to address, matters concerning the future, your child, and our family's standing. Reginald Blackwood." Eleanor read the note twice, then a third time, feeling the old pull of obligation tug at her chest. But the words were different now, pleading beneath the formality, threaded with desperation. The Blackwood fortunes were crumbling, and her father sought not reconciliation but advantage. For a moment, Eleanor felt the faint echo of the girl she once had been, the girl who longed to be seen, to be valued. But that girl had grown. Her life was no longer confined to the cold halls of Blackwood Manor. She had a home, a husband, a child on the way, and a future she had chosen. Still, she knew she could not ignore this final summons. When Gavin returned, he found her standing by the window, the letter clenched in her hand. He read it quickly, his jaw tightening. "You don't have to go," he said. "I know," Eleanor replied softly. "But I want to. I want to end this properly." Gavin studied her, then nodded slowly. "I'll go with you." Blackwood Manor was quieter than she remembered, less imposing, less alive. It looked tired, worn by years of pride and neglect. Her parents awaited her in the drawing room. Her father's posture was stiff, her mother's expression weary. Elizabeth lingered near the fireplace, uncertainty etched across her face. "Eleanor," her father began, "we wish to speak with you regarding your child. The future heir of Ashford will hold considerable influence. We hoped—" Eleanor raised a hand, silencing him. "I know why you called me here, but I will not allow you to use my child, or my marriage, for your gain." Reginald's face reddened. "We are your family, and Gavin is my family now," Eleanor said gently but firmly. "My child is my family. I will not let you drag us into your ambitions or failures." Her father sputtered, struggling for words. Her mother lowered her gaze. Elizabeth watched her with something like admiration. Eleanor continued, "I forgive you, truly. But forgiveness does not mean I owe you my life." Silence followed, heavy, final. Eleanor took Gavin's offered hand and turned toward the door. As they stepped into the corridor, she felt something lift from her chest, a weight she had carried her entire life. She had confronted her past and walked away unbroken. The carriage ride back to Ashford Manor felt different this time. Lighter, freer, as though a long, closed door had finally swung open behind Eleanor, releasing the last fragments of a life she no longer carried. Gavin held her hand as the countryside rolled by in soft shades of green and gold, his thumb brushing soothing circles over her skin. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and for the first time in her life, the world felt entirely hers. When they arrived home, the staff greeted them with warm smiles, relief evident in their faces. Eleanor knew they had worried, not about her safety, but about the pain her past might inflict anew. Yet as she crossed the threshold of her new home, she felt untouchable, protected by the foundation she and Gavin had built together. Later that evening, as dusk painted the sky in hues of lavender and rose, Eleanor and Gavin walked the gardens. The scent of blooming jasmine lingered in the warm air, and the soft trickle of the nearby fountain wrapped the moment in tranquility. Eleanor paused beneath an archway of climbing roses, her hand resting instinctively on the gentle swell of her stomach. "This child," she whispered, "will never know what it is to feel unwanted." "Insist." Gavin stepped behind her, his arms circling her waist, his voice a tender promise against her ear. "No, they will know love every day of their life, because they will know you." She turned in his arms, emotion shimmering in her eyes. "You've given me a life I didn't think was possible," she said softly. "You saw me when no one else did." Gavin cupped her face, his thumbs brushing away the tears that gathered despite her smile. "I didn't see what others missed," he murmured. "I saw what you tried to hide, your strength, your grace, your fierce, quiet courage. I only offered my hand. You chose to take it." Eleanor's breath caught. Once, she had believed herself insignificant, defined only by the harsh judgments of those who were supposed to love her. Now, she stood as a woman shaped not by their cruelty, but by her own resilience. A woman loved deeply and boldly by a man who cherished every part of her. Gavin lowered his forehead to hers. "There will be challenges ahead," he said softly. "As parents, as leaders, as partners, but we will face them the way we've faced everything else. Together," Eleanor finished. "Always." In the quiet glow of the setting sun, Gavin lowered himself to one knee, not in proposal, but in reverence. He pressed a gentle kiss to Eleanor's stomach, his voice warm and full of wonder. "I cannot wait to meet you," he whispered to their child. "You are already loved more than you know." Tears slipped down Eleanor's cheeks, but they were tears of joy, pure, overflowing joy. As Gavin rose and drew her into his embrace, she felt the fullness of her journey settle around her. The girl once despised had grown into a woman adored. The daughter cast aside had become a duchess, a wife, a mother. She had found her home. She had found her future. She had found her love, and it would endure.